Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. My name is Steve Kubler, and I'm the organizer of the series and professor of chemistry and optics and founding associate director of the UCF Center for Ethics. And I'm so excited that you're all here today. One of our biggest crowds yet, absolutely. And that's doubtless because our speaker is the acclaimed Stanford neuroscientist, Professor Robert M. Sapolsky. And he's going to join us to discuss an extraordinary claim that humans actually have no true free will in decision making. So we'll find out what evidence there is to support that claim and what the implications are. But before I introduce Professor Sapolsky, I'll say a little bit about our speaker series and how you can participate. Give me just a moment to switch back onto slides. Then I have to switch over to other things. That's hard to manage. So Ethically Speaking is organized with my collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who is professor of ethics and digital culture and founding director of the UCF Center for Ethics. And he and I developed Ethically Speaking to promote conversations about challenging issues of our time. So we encourage you to visit the center's website, and that's at ethicscenter.research.ucf.edu, to learn more about our activities and to find out about other speakers in our series. And I want to, again, encourage everyone, please email me with your suggestions for future speakers and topics in Ethically Speaking. We're coming up with these, but I want your ideas, and there must be some topics in ethics that you'd love to hear about. So please shoot me an email. I'm certainly spamming you. I deserve to get some email back from you with good ideas for what our speaker series should host. Ethics connects to, I think, every facet of our professional and personal lives. And the importance of ethics, I believe, at UCF should be clear from the long list of partners who support the series that I hope you can see on your screen I've shared. And all of us hope you enjoy these discussions. And we hope ultimately it cultivates more understanding of how ethics can provide frameworks for making better decisions, particularly when there are competing values. Today's event is being recorded, and we'll post a link to the recording on the Center for Ethics website so you can view it again, share it with others, bring others to our series. Now, as I tell you how we'll handle Q&A today, I actually have to do a few other little introductions. Dr. Beaver, my collaborator, cannot be with us today, unfortunately, to do his amazing work as moderator. And so instead, filling in for him is another good friend and true mentor, Dr. Bruce Jantz. So you'll meet him in just a bit. I think you can see him on the screen. Dr. Jantz is a professor of philosophy here at UCF. He has deep expertise in philosophy of science, epistemology, African philosophy, a whole bunch of stuff. And I can think of no one better equipped than Dr. Jantz to curate questions for our fascinating topic. So I greatly appreciate that he is here today. Throughout the talk, as you develop questions, please submit those questions via chat directly to Dr. Jantz. And he's going to curate those and at the end of the presentation help pose those questions by theme to Dr. Sapolsky. So that's how we'll run today. Now, I want to do another introduction, and we will turn to Ms. Gretchen Mihalik to introduce our actual speaker. Gretchen is pursuing the BA in Environmental Studies at UCF, and she is our newest intern for the Center for Ethics. We're very fortunate to have her expertise to help us with the center and our speaker series. Very great to have her in her debut at Ethically Speaking. So Gretchen, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kubler. It's so fun to be here. I'm very excited. I'm also excited to introduce Dr. Robert Sapolsky. So Robert Sapolsky is a neuroscientist and primatologist. He spent his career at Stanford University, where he's the John A. Cynthia Frygun recipient or professor of biology, neurology, and neurosurgery. He's a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship in 1987, an Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship, and an American Association for the Advancement of Science Award in 2007, among others. His research has focused on neuroendocrinology, particularly around stress. And we asked Professor Sapolsky not only to hear about his scientific work, but more to understand his recent and more controversial positions around free will. His 2023 book, Determine, sets out that science tells us we have no free will, or that free will requires some kind of causal indeterminism. He draws on research from neuroscience as well as the sciences of chaos, emergent complexity, and even quantum physics. His thinking has been critiqued by philosophers who argue that such moves by neuroscientists lead to intractable tensions and conceptual confusion. But challenging new perspectives like this helps us re-engage in new and invigorating ways with ongoing debates around free will and of course, its connection to ethics. It's a great pleasure to have Dr. Sapolsky with us today. Please join me in welcoming him to Ethically Speaking.
Well, thank you for having me here. Thank you, Gretchen and Stephen, for the invitation. Philosophers critiquing me is a very gentle and polite way of saying that virtually every philosopher I've encountered has hated the conclusion that there's no free will, and even more so that it may be gleaned by way of science rather than philosophizing. So I've had a lot of hate mail in the last 2 years. Okay, let me start off with the first slide because, oh, where did it go? There it is. Okay, so starting off, even though this book of mine came out a couple of years ago, I decided when I was 14 that there's no free will whatsoever, and have become, if anything, more convinced of that since then. And thus, I've spent a long time having people tell me this is way too extreme and this is a lunatic fringe opinion. And it basically is, but hopefully, I'll be at least a little bit convincing that we have so much less free will than people intuit that we got to do all sorts of stuff very differently in life. So we start off with this, and we have the hope of every fetus out there that they land into a stable, loving family with, housing that's reliable and food that's reliable in a country that has like some nice rights guaranteed and such. And we see here how every now and then, and with great frequency, in fact, it can turn out to be very different from that. So just looking at, ooh, how does this switch? Oh, okay, let's try this. Ah, perfect. Okay, so just looking at that, the sheer randomness of where you're born, if it's in Mississippi versus Norway, get Norway. On the average, you're going to live 11 years longer. You're going to have one-fifth the infant mortality. There's only a tiny fraction of the rate of maternal mortality in a place like Mississippi, violence, literacy, all of that. And what we see here is very few of us had a choice in the matter as to whose womb we spent 9 months in and where we landed when those 9 months were over. And this, for me, is a starting point to look at all the realms, starting with when you were a fetus up until what was happening in your endocrine system an hour ago, all the ways in which you are merely the sum of the biology over which you have no control and its interactions with environment over which you have no control. Okay, so starting off, let's start off at the fetal level. And what we have here is all the different versions of bad fetal luck. Let me see if this can disappear. All the ways in which you can spend 9 months in the wrong womb if you imprudently pick the wrong one. And we see all these versions of prenatal stress and some of the lifelong consequences. This was a field that got started initially with the recognition that prenatal undernutrition, prenatal starvation, 60 years later sets you up for about a 20-fold increase in your risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And since then, it's just gotten much more neuro, in my opinion, all sorts of neurodevelopmental disorders that become more common if you happen to have picked the wrong womb. If you had bad luck in there, something you had no choice over. So moving forward from that, so that's a bad outcome of the womb you chose. Next, the childhood you wound up with. And, science for quite some time has been willing to admit that childhood is important and actually matters. The sort of childhood you have has a lot to do with the sort of adult you turn out to be. And my wife and I, as parents, look at a picture like this and get all anxious about all the ways things can go horribly wrong if you wind up in the wrong childhood. And what you see is the big challenge in the field. Fortunately, at this point, nobody is debating anymore that childhood experience, the full range of it, will have lifelong consequences for behavior, for cognition, for psychiatric help, for every domain of that. What's the major question now in the field is how does it work? How does childhood experience change the way your brain works forever after? And for that, we get into an insanely trendy topic of epigenetics. Genetics, what your DNA sequences are. Nothing you can do short of having yourself irradiated is going to change the DNA sequences in your genome. What changes in response to experience is the regulation of your DNA, the regulation as to when you turn genes on and off. And this is the realm of epigenetics, regulating gene expression, starting early in life. And a misnomer in the field at the beginning was an epigenetic change is lifelong. It can be that, but it can also be reversed by stepping in and doing things to make for a better nervous system. Okay, so what do I mean by epigenetics? What would be an example of this? And here's one that still kind of flabbergasts me. Okay, amazingly enough, there are some mother rats who are better than other mother rats. What counts as a great mother rat? She licks her pups a lot. She grooms them. She carries them around. It's wonderful. Do that, and you're going to have like a wonderfully intellectually stimulated life. Some rat mothers are more attentive than others. And some work done, guy Michael Meany, an old collaborator at McGill University in Canada, showing what kind of mother you lucked out with when you're a rat pup has a big influence on all sorts of aspects of what's going to come later in life for you. And what he showed was if you had lousy luck, you had one of those inattentive mothers who ignored you, one of the things that happens is an epigenetic change in one part of the brain called the hippocampus, and they know which gene this happens to. And as a result, as an adult, you're going to have elevated levels of stress hormones in your bloodstream. And all sorts of circuitry problems that have brought that about, and all sorts of health outcomes that are going to be worse if you were constantly activating a mild stress response. So good. Here we see an epigenetic effect that is lifelong. But now consider that pup who, by the bad luck of having an inattentive mother, now has an excessive stress response for its whole life. One of the consequences of that is when she is a mother, she is on the average going to be less attentive because she's stressed. And thus, she will produce the same in her offspring, who may well grow up to produce the same in their offspring. And what you see is multi-generational transmission of a trait that's got nothing to do with genes, what's termed non-Mendelian transmission of a trait. What goes on early in life not only could influence the rest of yours, but could be multi-generational. So, of course, the question becomes, what are some of the factors that will influence what sort of early life you have? And if you're an anthropology type or something, cultural differences, and there's a whole universe of research looking at different types of cultures and different types of child rearing. Let me just show you, anyone who does sort of cross-cultural stuff in this area always gravitates towards the same dichotomy between what are called collectivist cultures, most dramatically in Southeast Asia, floodplain farming and such, and individualist cultures, with the United States being the most extreme poster child of that. And what you see is if you just happen by chance to have had landed with a mother who had a collectivist cultural upbringing or an individualist one, life is very different very early on. On the average, collectivist mothers sing lullabies more softly. On the average, individualist mothers have less physical contact with their kids. How long it takes on the average until an infant is picked up when they're crying, at what age they're weaned, if they're being breast milk fed at all, at what age are they sleeping alone. Every one of these things are already becoming apparent, some of them within minutes of birth. Already, the culture you landed in is beginning to shape the brain you are constructing with extremely different views about ethics and morals and group responsibility and why we're here and what life means. And this starts in us within minutes of birth. Okay, what also is coming on early on in life is what sort of home life you have landed into. And if your luck continues to be really lousy, here we see the world of childhood adversity, adverse childhood experiences. And hopefully, on like every pediatrician's wall in this country, is a chart like this showing it's even formalized your ACE score, ACE, adverse childhood experiences. If you were physically abused, that's 1 point on your ACE scale. If you were emotionally abused, that's another point, all the way up to an inconceivable ACE score of 10, versus those who have inconceivably good luck and have 0. And what you see is the higher your ACE score for each additional adverse childhood piece of bad luck, there's about a 35% increased chance, if you're male by age 20, to have a history of antisocial violence. If you were female, to have a history of teen pregnancies. Either sex, a history of sexually transmitted diseases, increased lifelong risk of major depression, major anxiety disorder, substance abuse. Every step getting worse in this list, and the likelihood of what your life is going to be like gets more grim on the average. And you had no choice in any of this. You had no control over any of these issues. So we push on, where do genes come in to what your early environment is like? And here's a summary of one of the like landmark studies that's been done in sort of psychiatric genetics in recent decades. I think the most important study in the last quarter century having to do with the gene. It's called 5-HTTP, and it codes for a protein that removes the neurotransmitter serotonin from the synapse. This is the gene for the serotonin transporter. And people had been doing animal research for years, rodents, primates, all of that. And it turns out in all those other species, this gene comes in 2 flavors. And it turned out if you had one of those flavors, you had a very significantly increased likelihood of being aggressive in adulthood. Oh no, I see this is the wrong slide. This is actually a gene called MAO alpha, monoamine oxidase alpha. Have the wrong version of it, the wrong flavor of it, and an increased likelihood of aggression if you're a rat, if you're a monkey. And looking at this, of course, people then wondered about humans. And we have 2 versions of it also. And people went and looked with if you have the scary version of the MAO alpha gene, do you have a greater likelihood of having a history of aggression by the time you're an adult? And the answer was absolutely yes, but only if you had a lot of childhood abuse. In the absence of childhood adversity, it doesn't matter which gene variant you had. Only when you have an interaction between your gene type and the luck you had early in life in terms of environment, only then do you see a big difference in terms of likelihood of antisocial behavior, incarceration by age 20, all of that. What do we see here? You had no control over which gene variants you got. You had no control over what your child environment was like when you were 3 years old. If you were learning that you were loved and safe, if you were learning that the world is a constantly menacing place. And here we see an interaction between your genetic luck and your early life environmental luck. No control over either. Okay, pushing on. What about a little bit later in the process? What about by adolescence? And this one slide here summarizes everything you need to know about adolescence. We've got 2 parts of the brain, one called the nucleus accumbens, and it traffics a lot in this neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine, everybody immediately knows that dopamine is about pleasure, it's about reward. Cocaine releases dopamine from neurons in the nucleus accumbens. It's actually more subtle than that. Dopamine is not so much about pleasure as much about the anticipation of it and the motivation that you derive from that dopamine. And the main point of this slide is by the time you're 12 years old, your nucleus accumbens is running on all its cylinders and it is already maxing out in terms of sensation seeking and novelty seeking and all of that stuff. And what we see, the line in black, is the explanation for all of teenagerhood because we have the most interesting part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. We've got more of it than any other species. It's the most recently evolved part of our brain. And what does the prefrontal cortex do? It makes you do the right thing when you were tempted to do otherwise. It gives you the strength for self-control, impulse control, long-term planning, gratification postponement. Prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that just when you're about to do some dumbass impulsive thing that you're going to regret for the rest of your life, it hopefully gets there in time to say, I wouldn't do that if I were you. And here's the critical explanation of adolescence. Your nucleus accumbens dopamine system is full blast by the time you're getting acne at adolescence, and the prefrontal cortex is not fully up to speed in us until we're about 25 years old. There's a lag between the two. And what does that begin to explain, this lag between the dopaminergic drives towards impulsive behaviors and novelty and sensation and the prefrontal cortex that's totally impaired at the ability to put its foot on the brake? What you see is this is why adolescents behave in adolescent ways. This is why the characteristics of adolescence are this impulsivity, the risk taking, all of that. This is the neurobiology of it. And there's a whole universe of early life experiences that will influence how much your prefrontal cortex develops and at what speed, and all of those bad luck, good luck variants of how things could be going are already playing out like this during your adolescent years. Okay, so let's push further along. Now let's look at your years since puberty hit, and maybe for some of you it's been a decade, maybe for some of you it's been 60 years, but we see here is just all the things that life may have thrown at you in those years, the adversity of trauma, addiction, depression, poverty, fear, anxiety, or the good luck of exercise, a stimulating environment, a life that teaches you you have efficacy, continuous learning at adulthood, finding purpose in life. And what you see is these are two very different trajectories of what kind of luck you've turned out to have in the decades since you got your prefrontal cortex in gear. And what we see on the right is one example of the fact that the brain you have for the remainder of your life changes for good, changes for bad, termed neuroplasticity. The brain you've got there reflects whether your luck has been good or bad over these years, and shown in that diagram, a landmark observation showing part of the brain called the hippocampus. And if you had the lousy luck of having major depression long term, that wasn't treated because you turned out to be treatment resistant, that wasn't treated because you were embarrassed to say you were depressed, that wasn't treated because you didn't have health insurance, any of these things. One example, the hippocampus shrivels up. Hippocampus has lots to do with learning and memory. It's just one part of the brain that can get stimulated for better or hammered for worse by what these years have been like for you. So now pushing on, we're now getting into the realm, not what the recent years and decades have been. How about like in the last couple of days or so? What do hormones have to do with how your brain is making decisions? And not hormones back when you were a fetus, but hormones you secreted last night over dinner. Where do they wind up being relevant? And there's two hormones that come to mind immediately because everybody has misconceptions about them. First one is the hormone testosterone. What testosterone does, everybody thinks, is make you more aggressive. Testosterone does not cause aggression. Testosterone makes you more sensitive to environmental triggers of aggression. Testosterone makes you more likely to interpret ambiguous cues as being threatening. And here we see, take somebody, give them some testosterone, and they don't even know they got it, and they are more likely to look at neutral expressions and say, the person looks hostile. The person looks menacing. I don't like this person. Testosterone changing how you are interpreting the social cues coming into your life. So that hormone is relevant. Another hormone that's equally relevant with a very different sort of public relations picture is the hormone oxytocin. Oops, that was a button I should not have hit. Let's try that again. Okay, oxytocin. Okay, stand by, Houston. Here we got it. Good. Oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone that is released into your body. It's also used as a neurotransmitter in the brain. And everybody thinks they know what oxytocin does, which is it's the love hormone. Oxytocin for the last 100 million years has promoted mother-infant bonding. For the last 30 or 40 million years, it's promoted bonding in species that pair bond, that mate for life. Oxytocin makes people more trusting and generous and better at reading emotions. And oxytocin is totally wonderful, and they should pour it into the water supply because this is what oxytocin does. This isn't quite what oxytocin does. Its picture, the incorrect one, is it is uniformly, universally pro-social. And here's what it actually does. This was a brilliant study done in the Netherlands some years ago, taking advantage of one of the fruit flies of philosophy, the runaway trolley problem. You got a trolley which is broken from its brakes or something. It's hurtling down the track. Inconveniently, there's 5 people tied to the track. It's going to hit and kill them. And you have to make the decision. Do you pull a lever that will divert that trolley onto a side spur where you're going to kill one person? Is it okay to kill one to save 5? Utilitarian stuff. And the thing that makes trolley problem like of endless fascination to psychologists is people make different decisions whether they will pull the lever or not, depending on how they feel that day, depending on how you word the scenario, depending if the scenario is one where you pull a lever to drop the person or you push them with your own hands. This is something where people's notion that they have stable moral decisions about this is nonsense. Okay, so here's what they did in this study. They got a bunch of college psych majors to come in and volunteer and sat them down to do the runaway trolley problem. And what they did was the person they are potentially killing, they gave the person a name. And in 1/3 of the cases, they gave a good old Dutch name like Dirk or Peter. And in the other cases, they gave names from 2 outgroups that people in Netherlands have very negative connotations about. German names. Oh, that's right, World War II, and Muslim names. So what happens when that hypothetical person gets a name? If the person, the volunteer is just sitting there and you haven't manipulated their hormones, it doesn't have an effect. But give the person some oxytocin. They don't know if they got it. The observer doesn't know if they've got it. It's done cleanly, all of that. Give somebody oxytocin, and this Dutch student is way, way less likely to sacrifice Dirk or Peter, and they're practically jumping out of their seats to push, Mahmoud or Otto onto the train tracks there. What does oxytocin do? It doesn't make you more pro-social. It makes you more pro-social to people who count as an us. And it makes you crappier to people who count as a them. It takes us them dichotomies and exaggerates the difference. That's what the hormones are doing in your brain. That's what testosterone, how you're responding to the world around you. And the same theme again, you did not have a whole lot of control over what your hormone levels were. Another example here. Here's one of my favorite studies, and there have been complaints about it, but I think it has absolutely stood up to statistical criticism and has been replicated. This is the hungry judges phenomenon. This was a study published in a very prestigious journal, Proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences, some years ago. Researchers looked at all of the parole board judges in the country where the research was being done. Parole board judges, the people who sit there and decide, okay, this person who's been in the slammer for years, they get to go free. This one goes back in. They make those, and they looked at every decision these judges had made over the course of a year, trying to see when they freed someone and when they put him back in jail. And they looked at every variable they could think of. And what turned out to be a highly significant predictor was how many hours had it been since the judge had eaten a meal. Appear before a judge right after they had breakfast or lunch. And in that study, you had about 60% chance of getting parole. Appear 2 hours later in front of the judge, and it had gone down to about zero. Oh my God, the judge's blood glucose levels had something to do with whether they decide this person had been reformed or not, whether this person should be released or whether they maintain menacing attitudes about it. Oh my, it's got to do with something. Yes, it's got to do with everything. Your blood glucose levels are going to be determining how much energy your brain has and how much energy the most expensive part of your brain has, your prefrontal cortex. And when you are deprived of enough glucose getting in there, you become more impulsive, you become less empathic. You have judges who have a harder time stopping themselves just when they're about to say, throw this guy back in jail, to say, wait, let me think about this. Let me think about the life this person has had that I have no experience with. Let me try to look at the world from their perspective. When you have a prefrontal cortex that's not getting enough energy, you become impulsive and you become unempathic. And that's the mechanism for this. And what amazes me is not only that it works this way, but if you sat down one of those judges who's just made a judicial decision, and I've had the chance to do that with some of these folks, sit them down and say, oh, that's really interesting. Remember a couple of hours ago, that person came who had been jailed for doing whatever, and you granted them parole. And just now, another person came in who seems to have done the same thing, and you threw him back in jail. Why did you make different decisions for them? The person is not going to tell you about their blood glucose levels. The judge is going to cite Kierkegaard or who knows what. They're going to come up with a completely false attribution. Blood levels of the energy your brain can spend on the hard job of seeing the world from somebody else's perspective. And since then, this study has been replicated. If you were going into a bank and you were hoping to get a home mortgage loan, don't go in when the bank official you're going to see has gone a few hours without eating. Catch them right after lunch, because you are much more likely to get your loan. Other circumstances as well. This has something to do with that when you had breakfast today, that's influencing your moral stances. That's influencing how you make decisions in the world. And all of this happens without us being aware of it. More examples. Here's one of the most depressing findings in all of social neuroscience in recent years. Take somebody, put them in a brain scanner, a volunteer, and flash up pictures of people's faces, different sorts of people. And in 75% of white Americans who wind up being volunteers in the study, 75% flash up a picture of someone whose skin color is different from yours, and your amygdala activates. Your amygdala, fear, anxiety, aggression. Oh, okay, because you've learned society has certain stereotypes. You don't believe in them, but nonetheless you have this. No, It doesn't work like this. Your amygdala reacts to the color of the person's skin in 60 to 70 thousandths of a second before you were even consciously aware of what you were looking at. And you were already activating pathways before the more fancy visual cortical areas in your brain is figuring out, okay, is that a face? What kind of face is that? I see two eyes, so that must be a face. And you're already 2, 3 seconds into deciding you are seeing something scary, depending on whose face you're looking at. And really good research has been done showing basically the exact same phenomenon when you are asking police officers who were volunteers in these studies to go in and look at who causes them when they have 1 second to make a decision, who causes them to decide that person is holding a cell phone or that person is holding a handgun. And it's the same realm with this. So, oh my God, that is so depressing. We are hardwired. So, in under a tenth of a second, we're racist. Now, do the study a different way. Now, I had to do some reading about this because apparently there's baseball teams in Florida. And I guess these are the two. And I'm just guessing, I know nothing about this, that they're bitter rivals. Now do this study again. Get a volunteer, stick them in the brain scanner, and you're flashing up faces of people, and each one of them is wearing one of these two baseball caps. There's a scattering of that. And when you do that, when the baseball cap of the team that you would kill for, that you would die on your bayonet for, when that comes up, you're absolutely delighted. And when the baseball cap comes up of the team that you hate and despise, and in under a tenth of a second, your amygdala activates. You're not looking at the faces anymore. Oh, who counts as an us or a them? Those categories can change in a second. So showing just how much who we have become at that moment is going to influence this. Okay, and what you wind up seeing is that's going to influence what we think about thems. Are they popular thems? Are there thems who are honorary members of our us group? All of that comes into play. So we now begin to look at how all of this plays out, how all of this turns into a picture, put those pieces together, and you have no free will. Because all of these different pieces I've been talking about, genetics and cultural evolution and hormones and all of that, they are not separate subjects. They all turn into the same thing after a while. For example, you're talking about the effects of genes on behavior. By definition, you are talking about millions of years of gene evolution. And by definition, you were talking about epigenetic effects that happened to your genes when you were a fetus. And by definition, you were talking about what genes you were activating this morning over breakfast. All the pieces merge together eventually. All the pieces become one arc of causality, and there is not a sliver of space in that arc to shoehorn in free will, to shoehorn in the notion that every time your brain can decide to do something independent of all of this history that came before. Okay, people hate this. People hate this because this makes no sense for two different reasons. The first one is we make decisions all the time. We make choices. You go into an ice cream store and you choose which flavor you want. You exercise your agency in doing that. And doing so has certain parameters. You're conscious that you're making that decision. You know that if you ask the person behind the counter for like liver fudge swirl or something, that's likely to be what you're going to get. Most of all, you know you don't have to do that. You could pick some other flavor. And for most people, and for the criminal justice system, conscious awareness, awareness of the likely outcome, and awareness that you have alternatives is enough to hold you responsible for your actions. And that's because it makes so much sense intuitively, because you're standing there and you're choosing. And in my view, this is looking in the totally wrong place. This is like deciding what you think of a novel by only reading the last sentence of it, because what it doesn't address is how did you become the sort of person who would have that intent? And the whole point is you have no control over those things that you formed. No matter how much you try, you can't intend to do something different than what you intend. You can't wish to think for something different than what you wish for. You can't will yourself to have more willpower. The moment when you are choosing is irrelevant unless you ask the question, how did I become that person in that moment? And that's all the stuff I've been talking about that you had no control over. So that's the first thing where people begin to riot, saying, wait, I just made a choice. I made a choice, and intuitively it felt so much like it. This is the first typical complaint. Here's the second one, which is every now and then you look at somebody who had the worst luck imaginable and somehow they pulled it together. They pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. They were a homeless street kid in Italy after World War II and they became a Nobel laureate. Or they can be Wilma Rudolph, who in 1960 was the fastest woman on earth, and she was born to a farm worker with 15 siblings, half of whom didn't survive childhood. And she got polio and was crippled. And at some point decided, I am somehow going to overcome this polio business, and trained and trained and trained. And eventually, the fastest woman on earth, record holder at the time, or just anybody who, with every bit of bad socioeconomic and sociopolitical luck, decides they are going to walk thousands of miles to get a better life for them in their life. You look at people like that and you said, oh my God, look at the free will, look at the tenacity, look at the backbone, look at the self-discipline that they were able to choose to exercise. And then you see conversely someone who's born with incredible luck, and most of the time, by second generation, they've pissed away the family fortune by indulgence. We look at people like that, and there's a false dichotomy that we fall into. We look at biological stuff. How smart are you? What color are your eyes? How tall do you turn out to be? What's your muscle twitch fiber ratio? All of that. That's biology. You had no control over that. But this is where people then make their mistake. They look at the right side of the column and they decide, do you have tenacity? Do you have grit? Do you stick through it? That's not made of biology. That's made of fairy dust. That's made of magic. That's the dichotomous mistake that people make. The stuff on the right is made of as much biology as the stuff on the left. And most of the biology on the right is what sort of prefrontal cortex you wound up having due to what life handed to you. Okay, so if you deal with those two complaints, ooh, people make decisions all the time. How do they become that decision maker? Ooh, look at these people who seem to be choosing to put on amazing displays of self-control and such. No, that's made of the same biological stuff. When you get to this point, as I do, the conclusion has to be there's no free will. There's nothing but the biology we were handed and its interactions with environment that we were handed. And what that leads me to is some conclusions. If you really truly believe that there's no free will, there's all sorts of things that could still be used for instrumental purposes, but have no virtue in and of themselves. Blame and punishment make no sense whatsoever. Praise and reward make no sense. Feeling that you have earned anything, that you are entitled to anything, that means that you should be able to be further up in the line than someone else, makes no sense. And hating someone for anything they've done is like hating an earthquake. None of these things make any sense. And great, okay, you reach this conclusion. How in hell are you supposed to live reaching conclusions like these? And what you see at this point, this is where people get very uptight and very worried. oh my God, if you convince people there's no free will, they're just going to run amok. They're just going to run wild because there's no constraints. There's by now a very solid literature showing that if you do it the right way, people don't run amok when they stop believing in free will. And in fact, they are as ethical in their decisions as people who have a deep fundamental belief in free will. No free will. What are you saying? Does that mean nothing can ever change? No, we obviously change dramatically. Individuals, populations, cultures, all of that change occurs. However, the key thing is we do not exercise free will and choose to change. Instead, we are changed by circumstance, and as a function of who you turned out to be when you were experiencing that circumstance. Oh my God, you can't blame or punish anyone anymore. What, you're going to have murderers running around the streets? No, of course, you construct a society in which you protect people from dangerous individuals, but you do so in the same way that you protect individuals from a car whose brakes don't work. You keep the car off the street. You protect people from it, from that person. You put the car in a garage, but you don't go in every day with a sledgehammer and hit the car over the hood because it's got a rotten soul. You can subtract that out. And conversely, even if you decide that praise and reward make no sense whatsoever. Oh my God, does that mean we're going to get rid of meritocracies? And when you've got a brain tumor and somebody's got to take it out there, you're going to pick a random person off the street? Because no, we can construct a society where we protect people from dangerous individuals, where we guarantee people are worked on by competent individuals without invoking a sense that there is any moral worth in what those individuals are good or bad at. Okay, so at this point, you say, this is ridiculous. You're supposed to adopt all this stuff. And again, I've been thinking this way since I was 14, and once a month for about 3 minutes, I can actually function as if I don't believe in free will. I can actually stop judging people. I can actually stop feeling all snarky and pissy if I feel like I deserve something that I do. No one is saying this is easy. No one at all. But the final point I want to make is nonetheless, we can do it because over and over and over, historically, we have done it. We have subtracted free will out of some realms of our human behavior. 400 years ago, if there was a sudden hailstorm that destroyed everybody's crops, you had a way of explaining it. The old woman with no teeth down to the edge of the hamlet chose to cause that storm with her magical potions. She's a witch. Burn her at the stake. And since then, we realized people do not have agency in controlling the weather. 300 years ago, if you had an epileptic seizure, people had an explanation for it. You'd been cavorting with Satan. You were demonically possessed and burned them at the stake also. And somewhere during the 19th century, people figured out, oh, it's not because they love Satan. There's something wrong with potassium channels in one party. It's a disease. It's a neurological disease. Somewhere in the 1980s, most psychiatrists learned that they had been doing something appallingly wrong for a long time, teaching mothers of people with schizophrenia that they, the mothers, caused the schizophrenia because they unconsciously hated their child. And then people figured out, no, it's a neurogenetic disorder. And every one of these, we've been able to subtract out a sense of free will. And not only does the roof not cave in, it becomes a more humane place. So it's going to be hard as hell, and I'm not very good at it, but we all have to try to over and over every time we think we understand why someone did what they did, we're probably wrong. So let me stop at this point.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sapolsky. We have some questions that have come in, as you can imagine. And I think the place that we'll start, a couple of people asked about the relationship between the kind of myriad kinds of causes that might affect our lives and the question of whether we can engage those causes as to choose some over others. So one person says, I don't see how having a million factors that affect our lives, including a lot of biology, results in the conclusion that we don't have the ability to choose at all. Another person asks, isn't it possible that I have some choice over the causes that affect me in the world, and asking us to act independently of all factors that influence us seems too strong a criteria for free will. And so
Okay,
let's start with that one.
somebody's been talking to every philosopher who hated the book. Okay, here's what we got. We've got this whole issue of, can things change? We got two people. They're both alcoholics. They are both capable of having found out that if they walk past a bar, they're tempted to go in. And thus, one of them walks down the street where there's a bar and they're able to exercise self control. They cross the street before they get to the bar. The second person walks past the bar and goes in there, and they both have learned the same thing about themselves. So, what do we see here? We are biological machines just like sea slugs are, but we're the only biological machines that can know that we are biological machines and learn where the buttons are and learn how to change our behavior if we turned out to be the sort of individual who could make use of that knowledge. You go and you see a movie, a moving thing about some historical event, you and your friend comes out and has forgotten the movie by that night, and you come out saying, that was amazing. I never knew about that. I'm going to go read some more books about this. How did you become the sort of person who could do this recursive loop and say, I want to strengthen that even more in me because I turned out to be somebody who likes reading. And I turned out to be lucky enough to be able to have books and food and a roof over my head. In all these cases, when you look at these mechanisms of change, it is when we turn out to be lucky enough to work with the knowledge about where our buttons are. And we have no control over that either. Okay, so you get a jury and they're trying to decide whether or not somebody who's a murderer did something terrible. And this person, when they were a kid, had a horrible car accident which destroyed their prefrontal cortex. And now they're a serial murderer. I actually worked on a law case with exactly this scenario. And in many states in this country, juries are enlightened enough to be able to say, oh my God, there's a gigantic arc that's made out of lead, that's made out of steel, going from that car accident that destroyed this person's prefrontal cortex and the fact that they did something appalling just now, this arc of determinism. You can see it. That's easy to see. That's an easy case. But then when we look at the person who's done the same murders and didn't have a car accident like that, and what you have to find are a million microscopic little spider webs of causality from the moment they were conceived as a fertilized egg, that all of those collectively did that. That's enormously difficult to recognize. Put all of those little spider webs together, and that's going to produce an arc of steel that is just as causative. It's just a lot harder to see subtle distributed causes in those cases.
So this collects a couple of thoughts from a couple of people here, but I'm wondering about the relationship between the past and the future. So in other words, everything you've talked about is the past. We can look back and identify causes, but we live into the future. And so let me try another way at this. Does your denial of free will also imply a belief in determinism?
Well, it depends on one's definition of determinism. Okay, this is where you got another problem when you say, oh, there's no free will. And somebody says, wait a second. Are you saying if you got on the scene 1 second after the Big Bang and you could know where every single particle in the universe was, you could predict what color socks this person is going to put on tomorrow? Is it predetermined in that deterministic way? Absolutely not. There's multiple possible futures. Why is that? Because of something very scientific, chaoticism, nonlinear systems out of which emerge things that are formally deterministic, but formally unpredictable. You can't sit there. You're never going to be able to do that because of butterfly effects and sensitive dependence on initial conditions and strange attractors, that whole world like that. It is formally impossible to predict the future because of that degree of nonlinear unpredictability. So, no, the future is not already set. And thus, if you know that this is the sort of person who will respond to this movie by reading more books on the subject and then sending money to Amnesty International, whatever, you can shape their behavior by suggesting some books to them. And
Mm,
you can do that because you turned out to be the sort of person who finds efficacy in that, and you see just loops all the way down. The future is not already set.
thank you. One person asked about, pointed out that a lot of these ideas seem to have some resemblance to Buddhism, and is wondering what you think about that relationship. Aldous Huxley, also in Island, even has a line refuting the existence of a me, some separate self-substance. Do you feel like there's any relationship between some of these Buddhist thoughts and what you're talking about?
I've been told that by a number of people. First off, I have to say I could not possibly be more ignorant about Buddhism. I know like
Okay.
nothing about it. Once I tried to meditate and it was great for about 3 minutes, and then I wanted to scream my head off because it was so sort of counter to what my basic makeup is. Oh, the dog's barking. Nonetheless, shh, apparently there's a resemblance to this Buddhist concept called unselfing. And what that is about is if you conclude none of us have earned anything, none of us have a right to have our concerns be considered more than anybody else's, that apparently has the same flavor as this Buddhist concept of unselfing, which taken to an extreme, there is no me that is deserving of anything. So apparently that sounds Buddhist.
Hmm. I'm interested in what kind of ethical theory might come out of this. There's been, and I'm sure you're aware of it, Greg Caruso had a discussion with Daniel Dennett around these sorts of issues. And Dennett was the compatibilist, and Caruso was very much like your position, although coming from a philosophical angle. So, do you have a sense of what kind of ethics might arise from this? In other words, how can we actually act in the world if this is true?
Yeah. Well, Greg Caruso is a wonderful, brave guy. He's also a good guy. We interact a lot. And a year ago, winter, I had one of the most frightening hours of my life, which is I debated Daniel Dennett. That turned out to be his last debate before he died. And I
Wow.
was terrified of this because he's this fire breathing free will advocate who, when you look at what he's saying, mostly says there's got to be free will because it's depressing as hell if it isn't. And I've gotten this really good life where I feel like I've earned all sorts of accolades. It's going to be a drag if I have to say I had nothing to do with it. I found him to be ethically very privileged and unempathic in his stance
Hmm.
of him saying things like bad luck and good luck even out over time, so you don't have to count them in. Bad luck does not even out over time. Everything about our society is structured so that bad luck gets worse and good luck gets better. What do you do with a system like this? Like, this is saying, among other things, don't talk to me about reform of criminal justice. The very premise of it makes no sense whatsoever. And Greg Caruso has been a leader at sort of fleshing out quarantine models of what do you do with people who are dangerous? You quarantine them. You quarantine them, which is to say, you figure out what's the minimum needed so that they are no longer dangerous in the realms in which they are dangerous. Do not restrain them 1 inch more than that. And don't preach to them about their soul. Just constrain them. And some countries, the Norwegian penal system has a flavor of that, even though it is still punitive in some ways and still based on some notions of retribution. But this sounds totally crazy. Oh my God, quarantine mom. We do it all the time. Your 5-year-old kid is sneezing a lot. What do? At school, they've got that sign up there saying, please, if your child has a cold, keep them home so they don't get everybody else sick. Your child is a danger to society. And what do? You quarantine them. You keep them home for the day. You don't take their toys away because they did nothing bad. You don't tell them they've got a rotten soul and that's why they're sneezing. We can construct quarantine systems. There's all sorts of parameters. There's lots of challenges. I'm not a criminologist, but Caruso has thought a ton about this. Yeah, that's the first policy thing. Get rid of a world of retribution and instead deal with a world of restorative justice and quarantines, a
Hmm.
world in which there are no value judgments because nobody chose to be that way.
Hmm. I'm not sure how long we can go on with questions here. Steve is running the show, but I'm going to continue because there are a number of really interesting questions that have come in. So let me try another one. Let's suppose that everything you say is true. What if we tell people this and it actually makes them worse? In other words, they actually use this notion that there is no free will to not take any control over what they are doing and just go out and actually become worse than what they currently are.
Yep, two psychologists, Roy Baumeister, who's very renowned, and an ex-student of his, Kathleen Vose, who's at University of Minnesota, did really interesting research on you sit people down and you tell them there's actually less free will than they think. You give them a passage that's very convincing from a book. They always read Francis Crick. You bias them versus a different view. And what you show in the immediate aftermath, get people to believe less in free will. And they then play an economic game. They cheat more. They cheat more. They stab people in the back. They run amok. Oh my God. The only possible conclusion is if you tell people there's no free will and they believe you, this is going to be a disaster. And it took another group to do the critical study for that, which is instead of getting people coming in who have no real opinion about the subject, here, read this or read this, they got people who already did not believe in free will compared to people who strongly believed in it.
Mm.
And what you saw was they were equally ethical in their behavior. What's the difference? If somebody has not believed in free will for years, they have thought long and hard about this. They have given a lot of thought to what do you make sense of the worst moments of human behavior and why are we here? And is there purpose in life? And what does it mean that I could have a brain that loves or is loved? And they've thought, if you've thought a lot about it, as has this person who stridently does not believe in free will, as has this person who has stridently decided there is free will and that has ethical implications, the key commonality is they've thought long and hard about it. And when you get people, if you start with 5-year-olds teaching, why did that kid do that thing? Maybe they've had a different sort of life than you. Maybe, and if you start with, they're going to wind up free will skeptics who are at the same level of ethical behavior as people whose moral compasses are built around the notion that we should be held responsible for our behavior.
Mm. Really interesting. Thank you. You know, you mentioned complexity theory at one point, and this is kind of collecting a couple of questions that came in. And I'm thinking about, some of the contemporary work being done on autopoiesis, the idea that in complex systems, there are kind of emergent states of organization that can happen when complex systems come in relation with each other. And I'm wondering if looking at the biological predecessors for questions of free will is maybe setting to the side that issue that we are meaning-making beings, we are narrative beings, we are beings who encounter the unknown and have to, as it were, wing it. And perhaps the ethics that we have is about encountering that unknown rather than being constrained by a past that we are necessitated to have. So, what would you say about that kind of emergent sort of notion of human life?
Well, we certainly are winging it a lot of the time. And what we know is when you are stressed, hungry, tired, etc., you wing it more destructively. But in terms of the specific topic of emergent complexity, I love emergent complexity. It's the coolest thing on earth. It's how you could take a whole bunch of stupidly simple little building blocks that could do only a few things, and you put a gazillion of them together, and it self-organizes. It self-organizes into an ant colony that can solve the traveling salesman problem. It self-organizes into the human cortex. It could self-organize into slime mold colonies that can solve mazes. It's totally great. It's absolutely amazing. And it's built on more is different. Throw enough quantity in there, and you invent a different type of quality. Understanding one H2O of water is never going to teach you what wetness feels like. It's an emergent property that's only explainable at that emergent level. Okay, so by all logic, that seems like what a great place to decide. That's where free will comes in. And there's a lot of people in the field who have argued that free will comes from emergent complexity in our brains. But when you look closely at the arguments they're making, there's always the same slippery thing that's done. It requires being able to be up at this emergent level to have downward causal powers to change stuff down there. The trouble, though, is all of those models assume that you can change down there the fundamental features of those simple building blocks. You can make them smarter. Those ants, once they have formed a big colony, suddenly the ants can speak French. Once you have this emergent stuff, and the whole point of what's amazing about emergence is the little building blocks are still as stupid and simple as they were beforehand. Every model by which you pull free will out of emergence, you got to hand wave at some point and decide the emergent level can reach down and change the nature of the building blocks down there.
Mm,
That's my rejection of
mm.
emergence for proving free will.
Great, thanks. We got a couple more here. One person asks, in what way are your arguments not circular? They seem circular to me in as far as any behavior that seems to reflect free will is explainable or explained as simply a result of upbringing or circumstance, and this seems to be inherently unverifiable.
Great. It's unverifiable until you do things like look at populations, and you can discover something like for every additional step in a kid's ACE score, there's an approximate 35% chance that they're going to be in trouble with the law. You look at those things, and at the aggregate populational level, it gives you some predictive power. It gives you some of that. And of course, the temptation winds up being for someone to say, yes, 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 all these things are really interesting. They influence us. They influence us. They don't determine us. And prove to me there's no free will. Prove to me there's no Easter bunny. Prove to me there's not invisible whatever's flying around my head. You can't ask somebody to do that. But by now, we know enough of this matrix of explanation of how we become who we are that you could turn the tables and say to somebody who insists there's free will, prove it. Show me how it is that that brain just did what it did, independent of the history of its ion channels, its growth factors. If you can prove that to me, you've just proven free will, and everything I'm saying is gibberish, and nobody can do it. And we know enough on this side that it's free will believers. It's their job now to prove it.
I'm going to ask one last question because I think we're running out of time here, but we've had a question about um, how or whether we should be able to tell the difference, on your view, between an intelligent human and a true general AI.
Oh, God. I know much, much more about Buddhism than I know about AI. So all I know about AI is it's destroying my ability to grade students' papers because of goddamn chat GPT and like this whole crisis here. And should I just retire? I don't understand that stuff. My son is an AI CS person, and when he's in a good mood, he says it's going to transform and solve every human ill. And when he's in a bad mood, he says 10 years, 10 years, the machines are going to harvest us for our carbon. All I can tell is this is massively important. And over again, we have seen that new technology tends not to liberate the downtrodden. So I don't expect good things coming out of this trend.
Mm. Well, there are a bunch more questions. I've tried to group them into similarities, but I know I've missed some of you, and I'm really sorry that we couldn't get to everyone. But I think, if I'm right, Steve, that we are pretty much at the end of our time. Is that right?
Well, I guess we are. It's it's unfortunate, but you've certainly given us a lot to think about, and I greatly appreciate that. So thank you so much, Dr. Sapolsky, for joining us today and sharing your ideas. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I think all the more fascinating for the wonderful questions that we got from our audience. So thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Dr. Jans for moderating our discussion, and for Gretchen for doing the introductions of our guest speaker. And as always, again, thank you, participants, for your great questions and engagement. I'll just remind everyone that a recording of this presentation will be made available on the UCF Center for Ethics website, so you can view it again and you can share it with others. I hope others find it as amazing as I have. There's also links to our past talks and information on upcoming presentations. We've really had some great speakers. I hope you'll find the time in your busy day to go back and look at some of those past talks because they're also truly exciting. If you'll bear with me for a minute, I'm going to tell you about another upcoming talk that I think is really going to be great. And let me just go ahead and share my slides for a moment here. Using animals in research, is an increasingly controversial issue, and estimates vary widely, but suggest about 50 to 100 million animals are used annually, with many of these being euthanized at the endpoint of a study. But bioethicist Joel McClellan argues that euthanasia is a euphemistically misused term that misleads the public by masking the conditions and decision making associated with animal death for research. And he asserts that better definitions and oversight are actually needed to ensure more ethical treatment of animals in research specifically, of course. And Dr. McClellan is the director of the Environment Program and assistant professor of philosophy at Loyola University, New Orleans. And his research in bioethics is informed by a lifetime of experience that includes time in the Peace Corps, the Community Environmental Conservation Program in Panama, field experience with USAID, and service on Loyola's institutional animal care and use committees and institutional review board. So please visit the UCF Center for Ethics website right now and register for Dr. McClellan's presentation. I think you're going to find it fascinating. Ethically Speaking is made possible with support from the National Science Foundation and the many UCF partners that you see listed here. I'd like to thank them for all helping bring this series to you. And lastly, thank you for your participation. I hope you'll join us for another future presentation in Ethically Speaking.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation again.
This is really
Thank
great.
you, Dr.
Thanks.
Sapolsky.
Thanks.